What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Fantasy Football Fellas YouTube channel. My name is Tyler Plath, and today we are discussing the 10 best players to add from waivers after Week 10. And we are getting closer and closer to fantasy playoffs, and that means that we need to have the best possible rosters in order to have a shot at winning it all. And some of the guys on this list will certainly help that case. So before I begin, if you're not subscribed, what are you doing? This is your place for all things football, all things fantasy football. So make sure you're subscribed and have that notification bell turned on so you know whenever we post daily, but also whenever we go live on Sunday mornings to answer any last-minute questions you may have with injuries and starts and sits, all the sorts, Sunday morning. So make sure you're subscribed. Have that notification bell turned on. So with that, we'll start with Texans running back Devin Singletary, and technically he doesn't meet the 50% roster criteria that we use, but Singletary is an exception because this is the last opportunity you will have to add him to your team. In Week 10, he saw 30 rushing attempts en route to a running back 3 finish before Monday Night Football, and this was by far the best statistical performance by a Texans running back this year. Now, that could be because Dameon Pierce was out. So once he comes back into the fold, we're probably going to see a 50-50 split. We're probably going to see a 55-45 split depending on game script. We're not going to see a running back 3 performance from either Devin Singletary or Dameon Pierce. But it wouldn't surprise me if we see that 55-45 split, maybe even 60-40 split, in favor of Devin Singletary because of what he's been able to do with a full workload. Like I said at the beginning, this is the last chance that you have to add Devin Singletary. And if you have Dameon Pierce or if you are needing some running back depth, Devin Singletary, if he's not the best, he's one of the best options this week on waivers. Another great option is Vikings running back Ty Chandler, who dominated the snap count in the Vikings backfield after Alexander Mattison left with a concussion. And on the day, Ty Chandler did only put up 10 fantasy points, but he could have had more. He had a second rushing touchdown callback because of a holding penalty. And as I mentioned not 10-15 seconds ago, Alexander Mattison left the game with a concussion. And the trend this year is that players will typically miss the following week after a concussion. So that means even more work for Ty Chandler. And take it from your resident Vikings fan when I say this. Ty Chandler's performance on Sunday was the best looking performance from a Vikings running back all year. So even when Madison comes back, we're going to see Ty Chandler still involved in the offense. So at the bare minimum, Ty Chandler is a great handcuff heading into fantasy playoffs. Next guy up is a guy that we talked about on last week's waiver video, and that is Keaton Mitchell of the Baltimore Ravens. And just like Devin Singletary, this is the last week, more than likely, that you will have to be able to add Keaton Mitchell. Despite playing on only 11 snaps, maybe because of the hamstring issue that he was dealing with during the week, he still finished as the leading rusher for the Ravens backfield. And you may hear 11 snaps and say, well, he's probably stuck in a 3-man backfield with Justice Hill and Gus Edwards. But that may not be the case exactly, because according to Nathan Yonke of Pro Football Focus, Gus Edwards and Keaton Mitchell split first quarter snaps 9-6. So yes, Gus Edwards probably still the lead back in this backfield, but Keaton Mitchell seems to have overtaken Justice Hill as the running back 2 or as the 1B option in that backfield. And if Mitchell keeps producing like he is, it wouldn't surprise me if he overtakes Gus Edwards by the end of the fantasy season. That's 3 straight running backs to start things off. So let's look at some wide receivers now, starting with Noah Brown of the Houston Texans. And we should start by discussing how this Texans wide receiver room is breaking down. You have Nico Collins, you have Tank Dell, and you have Noah Brown. And now Robert Woods back in the mix because he came back from his injury in Week 10. The first 3 that I mentioned have all been productive over the last couple weeks. But who's the 1, who's the 2, and who's the 3 in this offense? And if we look at snap count, Tank Dell has been playing the most out of the 3. So we could slot Tank Dell in as the wide receiver 1, again, based on snap count. But Nico Collins and Noah Brown are relatively the same in snap counts. And every now and then, depending on the game and the opponent, one will out-snap the other. So we're looking at Tank Dell as the wide receiver 1, again, on snap count. And then you've got Nico Collins and Noah Brown as the 2A and 2B wide receivers. But no matter how you draw it up, each of these wide receivers have found success, and Noah Brown has found it most recently. He's put up 27 and 24 fantasy points in his last 2 games and could continue to produce if we see the Texans' backfield regress in any way. And yes, I mentioned Devin Singletary at the very beginning as a worthy add this week, but that's a reality that you have to accept with a Texans running back, is that it's probably not going to be as productive as we just saw it in week 10. So again, just like the first 3 guys I talked about, even if the production falls off for Noah Brown, he becomes one of the most valuable handcuffs, at least at the wide receiver spot, because we've seen what he can do in an increased role like we just saw in week 10. Now, Rashid Shaheed is next, and Shaheed saw an uptick in volume after Michael Thomas left the game after only 2 snaps, which that's just some unfortunate luck. But again, after only 2 snaps, he left with a knee injury. And even after Derek Carr left the game in the third quarter with his injuries, he had a right shoulder injury and then a concussion as well. Jameis Winston targeted Shaheed 4 times, which was still behind Chris Olave. And Chris Olave actually picked up all of his targets, if not for maybe 1 or 2 from Jameis Winston. But the takeaway is that Shaheed was still plenty involved in the offense after Michael Thomas and Derek Carr left with their injuries. Now, it was A.T. Perry that replaced Michael Thomas from a role perspective, but if Michael Thomas misses any time, Rashid Shaheed becomes one of the best adds of the week because of the uptick in volume that he will likely see. So while the snap count may not reflect it, the target share and the receiving yards, maybe some touchdowns along the way, Rashid Shaheed is the next guy up from a fantasy perspective. On to the next one, and I really despise this. I really don't want to talk about this because this team caused me to lose in almost all of my leagues this week, but it's the Dallas Cowboys, and we're going to talk about Brandin Cooks, who led all Cowboys wide receivers in receiving in week 10. This really comes down to the fact that the Cowboys are winning through the air, through their passing game, with minimal help from their rushing attack. That's a whole other discussion for another time, and one that infuriates me to the same level as Arthur Smith not utilizing his top playmakers. But again, that's another discussion for another time. Back to Brandin Cooks. If the Cowboys continue to rely on their passing game the way that they have been over the last 3 weeks, that suddenly adds some value to Brandin Cooks and other pass catchers like Jalen Tolbert, who actually overtook Michael Gallup as the wide receiver 3 based on snap count in week 10. Add some value to Michael Gallup. Maybe he can earn back his wide receiver 3 spot, and it puts some value on Jake Ferguson, who has been turning in some decent performances lately himself. But again, that added value because of the extra reliance on the passing game makes Brandin Cooks one of the best adds this week. Not guaranteeing another performance like we saw in week 10, but again, there's value, there's handcuff potential and value with a guy like Brandin Cooks in this offense that is relying so heavily on their passing attack. Last couple guys before we get to our quarterback and tight end stream, starting with Zach Charbonnet, who we talked about on last week's episode, just like Keaton Mitchell. And the points that I can make for Sharps in this video are very similar to the points that I made in last week's video, where the roles are clearly defined for Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet. And it's happened for the 3rd straight week now, where Kenneth Walker dominated in carries and early down work. Zach Charbonnet dominated in passing down work in the 2-minute drill. So what that tells me, again, after 3 straight weeks of this, is that Zach Charbonnet is more game script dependent than anything else, because we may not see Zach Charbonnet if Seattle is blowing out their opponent. But I don't see Seattle dominating their opponents in really any of their upcoming games. So that means we'll see more Zach Charbonnet. And what isn't being talked about enough is that Zach Charbonnet, has been more efficient with his carries than Kenneth Walker. It has to at least be recognized that Zach Charbonnet could cut into Walker's playing time on early downs. And that makes him one of the most important adds if you have Kenneth Walker. You need that insurance, you need that backup in case Kenneth Walker starts losing snaps to Zach Charbonnet. But for everyone else, take note of what this backfield is doing right now. Because if things change in Seattle and you catch the Kenneth Walker manager slacking a little bit, you may be able to add a lead back in one of the better offenses in the league. Now, I've stayed away from this guy really ever since we started fantasy drafts earlier this summer. But with Kyler Murray back in the fold for the Arizona Cardinals, Rondale Moore suddenly is an intriguing option. Rondale tied with Trey McBride for the highest target share of all Cardinals players on Sunday. And if you look back at the last 6 games with Kyler Murray, including Sunday for Rondale Moore, he's averaging 6 receptions on 8 targets for 59 yards. So yes, that's like 11, 12 fantasy points. But for this year, 11 to 12 fantasy points is somewhere between the wide receiver 34 and the wide receiver 42 on a per game basis. That's prime depth territory. And as Kyler gets more and more comfortable, that could mean more for Rondale Moore. So it's at least worth keeping tabs of, because Marquise Brown also only had 4 targets. And I have to think that his target share is going to go back up with Kyler Murray back in. So keep a tab, keep an eye on Rondale Moore. Maybe the target share stays, maybe it drops a little bit, but if it's anywhere from 20 upwards, Rondale Moore is certainly a great depth piece to have on your team then. All right, on to our quarterback tight end streams of the week, and to be completely honest, these guys have a legit argument to actually be rostered, but for the sake of the segment, we'll call them streams. And the first guy is Vikings quarterback Joshua Dobbs. And boy, has he been great. He has been phenomenal in his 2 games with the Vikings. He's put up 25 fantasy points in both of his games in the purple so far. And the best thing about Dobbs is that even with a full week of preparation, he still found a way to have 44 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. That kind of rushing upside, with the weapons at his disposal, Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson, who, can we just take a minute and appreciate the first half that TJ Hawkinson had? Holy smokes. You have those guys, but then you have Justin Jefferson coming back. You'll have KJ Osborne back in the mix. Josh Dobbs has to be on rosters moving forward. And if he isn't, and you can take advantage of him as a streaming option, do it. Do it. Because 25 fantasy points. Now, let me be honest. 25 fantasy points isn't going to be the consistent, isn't going to happen every single week. But if you can get 18 to 22 fantasy points every week from Josh Dobbs, that's certainly startable in most fantasy teams. In the tight end stream is Tyler Conklin. Yes, that Tyler Conklin on the New York Jets. While he has Zach Wilson as his quarterback, and yes, I know that could be something that pushes people away, Wilson is actually looking his way, and Conklin is averaging 13.5 fantasy points per game the last 2 weeks. 13.5 fantasy points. And the reason why he may be more than just a streaming option is because of the upcoming schedule that he has. He has Buffalo, Miami, Atlanta, Houston, Miami again, Washington, and Cleveland the rest of the fantasy season. And combined, those teams are allowing 12 fantasy points per game to tight ends on the year. And Cleveland is allowing the least, so if you took them out, it's even higher. The work he's been getting with the schedule that he has the rest of the way makes him a great streaming option. There's an argument to be made that he can be rostered, But when people hear Tyler Conklin, New York Jets, I don't think that they would spend an extra second thinking about it, and so they'll move past him. So Tyler Conklin might be best suited just in a streaming role. But like I said, his production with the schedule that he has up ahead makes him a great option. So keep him on your watch list. If you're struggling to find your tight end, Tyler Conklin might be your guy. And that'll do it for our 10 Week 11 waiver wire ads and a quick recap of those 10 players that we discussed. Devin Singletary, Ty Chandler, Keaton Mitchell, Noah Brown, Rashid Shaheed, Brandin Cooks, Zach Charbonnet, Rondale Moore, Joshua Dobbs, and Tyler Conklin. Thanks for tuning in. Give this video a like if you've made it to this point in the video, and subscribe if you aren't already with that notification bell turned on too. We'll see you tomorrow with the latest episode of the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast, and then on Wednesday for our weekly trade targets video. So until then, deuces.